Welcome to session B for the moment, connectivity and evolution of far-right movements. So I'm Helen Young from Deakin University. Two of my colleagues from Deakin are the speakers today. So we have Dr. Callum Jones, recently come to us at Deakin. He's going to be our first speaker. We then have Associate Professor Matteo Vergani. Callum is obviously our first. Speaking to us on political parties and online radicalisation in the Australian far-right landscape. So 20 minutes, there'll be a 5-minute warning and a 2-minute warning.
Great.
After that, I'll start clapping.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I might just grab my board. Hi, guys. Yes, I'm Callum. I'm here presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Imogen Richards. So this presentation is specifically on the Australian far right. Swing it around. Oh, that way.
That's the speaker.
Okay. I probably shouldn't have touched it, should I? Okay. Great. Yes. So Australian far right political parties, and specifically interaction between those political parties and non-political party far right actors. At the outset, what I'm going to do is just sort of seek to define what I mean when I say far right and what I mean when I say political parties, and then how these concepts meaningfully make sense together by outlining the theoretical framework that supported this particular piece of research. So the framework was informed by the scholarship of Cass Muda and Michael Minkenberg, who are two giants in the field. And what they posit, generally speaking, between the two of them and what has come to be widely accepted throughout the scholarship is that there are two major ways in which you can delineate different elements of far-right politics. One criterion being ideological, and the other criterion being organizational. So what do groups believe? And then how do they manifest to come to try and create whatever it is that they believe? In terms of ideology, there's two main ideological subgroups within the far right. There's the radical right and there's the extreme right. I won't bore you with too many of the details, but sort of the bullet points are that the radical right tend to focus on the protection of Western values, anti-immigration, nationalism, and marginalising non-dominant social groups. They oppose liberal elements of democracy. However, they don't oppose the actual concept of democracy itself. So they still operate within existing liberal democratic frameworks because they believe that change can occur in that way. Conversely, the extreme right tend to focus on traditional neo-Nazi and fascist ideologies. They're authoritarian, xenophobic, nationalistic, fundamentally anti-democratic and racist. So they valorize revolutionary violence, call for a violent uprising, and as you can imagine, oppose the concept of democracy in favor for authoritarian frameworks. Organization, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I know that I don't have that much time, but there are a few important delineations in terms of how far-right politics organizes that I need to outline. Number one, political organizations. So at their simplest, they are organizations that are attempting to influence the country's politics, but they do not compete in elections or have ceased to do so. So perhaps they were once competing in elections, but no longer, they're a deregistered political party, for instance. Social movements are a sustained challenge to power holders in the name of a population living under that jurisdiction. Alternative news media outlets are news outlets that oppose mainstream media because there's a perception that there is an underlying corruption or bias within that media. And the alternative news media outlets claim to provide a sort of an uncensored or real version of the news. And they can be alternative in different ways, such as content sources, means of production, dissemination, modes, and values espoused. And finally, political parties are groups that compete in elections for public office, and as such, they can achieve legitimate control of governments through an electoral process. So that's our background. I think hopefully we all kind of know what I mean when I say far right political parties, the differences between them. So I just want to briefly touch on what far-right political parties have looked like within Australia over time, and then we'll detail the actual specifics of the study. So in brief, the 1960s to the 1980s, there was a contingency of extreme right political parties. So these were openly neo-Nazis, they were fascist groups post-World War II. They were political parties in name only, in that they failed to gain any kind of electoral success. Some of these parties include the National Australian Workers' Party, Australian National Socialist Party, so on and so on, lots of sort of vaguely similar sounding names, and they evolved from and into each other in different capacities and shared a lot of membership. 80s to 2000, we saw a rise in success of radical right political parties, so not openly neo-Nazi or fascist. They gained electoral success, and one of the main things that they were mobilizing on was anti-immigration sentiment throughout the 80s and 90s. Think Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party. Another little known one, but actually one that did gain electoral success, was the Confederate Action Party. 21st century radical right parties continued to mobilize, however, with mixed levels of success. The ideology shifted from anti-Asian predominantly, which was what Pauline Hanson initially ran on, to anti-Islam. And these kinds of parties were Pauline Hanson's One Nation, where she came back in the 2016 election, then Fraser Anning's Conservative National Party, Rise Up Australia, a few others that largely didn't gain much electoral success. 2020 to present, some of these radical right political parties have continued, such as Pauline Hanson's One Nation, and then there's been some COVID conspiracies and political parties that have mobilized alongside that, along with the freedom movement that was tied up with the COVID-19 pandemic, an example being Ricardo Bossi and the Australian One Party. So with that as background, the gap that this study sought to fill was, we know quite a good amount about far-right political parties. However, we don't understand the ideological interactions and connections between those far-right parties and non-party actors that may well support the same ideology. And as you'd assume, would be the people voting for those far-right political parties. So we aim to establish how non-party elements of the Australian far-right portray and engage with parties that align with their ideologies, so people who represent their interests. How do they feel about them? What do they think they're doing? Do they think they're doing a good job? And we pose the research questions: how does the non-party sector perceive Australian far-right parties and actors? And what is the role of the Australian far-right political parties in the broader Australian far-right landscape? So to conduct our study, our methodology, we took large data sets from social media, and we stratified them across the different forms of political organisation that I outlined previously. So we looked at Australian far-right social movements, Australian far-right political organisations, and Australian far-right alternative news media outlets. And we harvested a whole lot of online data through various computational approaches. The social movement that we looked at was QAnon, which is a far-right conspiracy theory and militarized social movement. We collected data, huge data sets, well, not that huge, but large data sets from Twitter and 8chan, which is was formerly 8chan. 37,000 tweets, 9,000 8chan posts. We harvested 3,000 posts from 6 prominent Australian neo-Nazi Telegram channels, from the kind of contemporary neo-Nazi groups that you would have heard about in the news in the last week and the last 2 years sort of preceding that. Alternative news media outlets we drew from the XYZ and the Unshackled, which are the 2 biggest alternative news media, far-right alternative news media outlets in Australia. We collected all of the articles they'd ever published from each one of those outlets, which was 7,000 from the XYZ, they're very busy, and for 3.5 from the Unshackled. Now, the actual process by which we figured out or selected text that was discussing far-right political parties was we used a named entity recognition, which is a machine learning approach which is designed to extract named entities from within written text. So it's natural language processing. And what it can do is it can identify places, names of people, names of organizations, times, dates, and even ideologies or beliefs. So we used an NER to basically pass through all of the text data, so hundreds and hundreds of thousands of sentences, and it extracted every single named entity from within that data set, every single one. And then we went through and we manually validated every single one of those to look for all that fell within the classificatory criteria of far-right politician or far-right political party. And then we used that list to pass through all of the data and select all of the sentences that were discussing far-right political parties or far-right politicians, which yielded about 8,000 sentences. We did quantitative analyses to basically determine who was being spoken about at what volume and stratified that over time to see time as a factor, who maintains relevance, who dips in relevance, and so on. We paired this with a sentiment analysis. So this is another machine learning approach, which is used to determine the positivity, negativity, neutrality, and compound sentiment score of written text. So it's to establish basically how people feel about something in written text. So we paired this with the computational quantitative analysis to figure out whether the parties were being perceived positively, negatively, or neutrally, and to what degree. And then we used that to find highly polarizing content that was focusing on far-right politicians and political parties and understand what was creating that, that polarizing discourse, what was the topic of it. So what did we find? We found that, so this is mentions over time of political parties. We found that Pauline Hanson's One Nation was by far the most mentioned political party within the corpus. By a significant margin, it had 4 times as many mentions as every other political party combined. The next most mentioned parties were, number 1, the Australian Liberty Alliance, which formed in 2015 and rebranded as the Yellow Vest Alliance in 2019. And the next was Rise Up Australia Party, which is formed in 2011, but gained a lot of exposure and traction during the 2015 to 17 Reclaim Australia rallies. But as you'll see from the numbers, political parties were not discussed nearly as much as politicians were, and this isn't that surprising within the context of far-right politics. Generally speaking, they are one-person parties, so the party is defined centrally around one person. So think of Pauline Hanson's One Nation; she is the party in many ways. So Pauline Hanson's One Nation was the most mentioned. However, Pauline Hanson wasn't the most mentioned within the text corpus. She was the second most mentioned. However, as you can see, stratifying over time, she was the most consistently mentioned, which tracks given that she's been the most consistently dominant member of the far right in terms of elected politicians in history. There are a bunch of other fond members or politicians that received mentions, like Mark Latham, George Christensen, Malcolm Roberts, and Rod Cullerton. Ricardo Bossi ended up being the most discussed within the text corpus. He's basically started a political party that was centered on a lot of QAnon conspiracy theories. And as you can see, he peaked in terms of mentions disproportionately, almost exclusively in 2020 during the pandemic, and then faded into irrelevance. Former Senator Fraser Anning was the third most mentioned, peaking in 2018 to 19, which was the lead up to the 2019 federal election, and he subsequently lost his seat. And as you can see, discussion of him then petered down significantly post that. So we know kind of who was spoken about when and to what degree. It's interesting to then explore how each one of these non-party sectors frame political parties. So QAnon communities were generally positive in terms of their framing of far-right politicians and parties. They framed politicians, far-right politicians, as standing up to globalists, people like Pauline Hanson. And there was an endorsement of associated conspiracy theories that far-right politicians and political parties were pushing, which is a common trope within the far-right. So there was, support for Pauline Hanson's suggestion that the 1996 Port Arthur massacre was a government conspiracy, and Ricardo Bossi's various 5G, fluoride, pedophile ring kind of coalescence of conspiracy theories that he was peddling during 2020. Alternative news media outlets were generally sympathetic to Pauline Hanson as a defender of free speech, and there were characteristic claims within alternative news media that Pauline Hanson was being subjected to unfair and biased coverage. Sympathetic portrayal of Pauline Hanson and Fon lessened over time. And this was really interesting. I've just written another paper that is on alternative news media. And there was a period of time when these alternative news media outlets were basically managed to convert a bunch of the senior editors to neo-Nazism. And in line with that conversion of senior editors, the amount of support that was there for radical right political parties started to decrease. So which shows that it's very ideologically driven, and there is very significant disagreement between the radical and the extreme right on lots of different things. There was particular criticism within the discourse of Pauline Hanson's One Nation running a Muslim candidate in 2019, and also Pauline Hanson's condemnation of Fraser Anning's final solution statement, which I'm sure many of you remember in his maiden speech. There was sympathetic portrayal of Fraser Anning, who engaged in very open neo-Nazi and white supremacist discourse, which tracks with certain alternative news media outlets becoming more explicitly neo-Nazi. Neo-Nazi groups, probably not that surprisingly, are quite critical of Pauline Hanson. The extreme right tend to be critical of the radical right, broadly speaking, because they perceive them as sellouts, as having not done enough or currently not doing enough, too scared to engage in the kind of violence that is necessary and so on. So not terribly surprising that they were critical. It was interesting to see that there was an interweaving of criticism of radical right political parties and anti-Semitism, in that there was the claim that Pauline Hanson had maintained her electoral success because she became a servant to the Jews. There was support for Bossi, mainly in the overlap between his anti-vaccine politics and the anti-vaccine politics of neo-Nazi groups. And yes, condemnation of the critical media coverage. So I know I'm about to run out of time, so I'll briefly wrap up with some concluding thoughts. We found that there are far-right political figures and parties that have maintained steady prominence, not only just present, as in they're electorally, successful, but also they remain discussed and supported within the broader far-right ecology. Certain actors had short-lived community-specific and issue-specific success, such as Riccardo Bossi, whose influence died with the relevance of COVID-19 conspiracy theories. Non-party actors vary in their emphasis on politicians and parties. Extreme right groups are less likely to be particularly supportive of the radical right, even though they align on a lot of different things, because the extreme right stand against democratic processes. And finally, there is huge fluidity and propensity for change, especially time-bounded change, within the context of these sort of ideology and discourse networks. And it's very important that when we study these kinds of groups, we don't study them in isolation, which was the premise of this work. So we studied various different groups and sought to understand how they interact with each other, not just physically, but ideological interaction. And then stratifying that over time is fundamentally important as well, because then you can understand how the ecology and the network, broadly speaking, is changing. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
So we'll go to questions for the session. Matteo, if you want to.
Good luck.
Thank you for the presentation. Really liked it. Okay. That should work.
That's
There we go. Excellent. Thank you. And I'm presenting a paper today on behalf of other co-authors, Tierno Diallo at Western Sydney, Kerry O'Brien at Monash, and Haley, who's presenting next door, Haley Tran. Look, the paper is ready. I printed a copy. We are about to submit. So if you have any suggestion, it's very welcome. If you want to look at the numbers, please, all the tables are in the paper. I will not present too many statistics, but we have everything down. Let me start by saying we changed the title since the submission, because I know the word profiles makes people cringe a little bit in this field, because there were a lot of discussions in the field of terrorism studies about, okay, can we profile individuals at risk of radicalization? Should we move from profile to pathways? John Hogan in a famous article. Well, the thing is that what we are trying to do is really profiling, meaning we are using latent profile analysis, which is a statistical technique to identify profiles in the population. So, I mean, it's okay if you have criticisms, we can still be friends after this, but this is really what we're trying to do. So creating profile based on demographic data. So I guess the challenge we wanted to address is theoretical, but also really practical. Most research in violent extremism looks or tries to understand the canary, using Noemi's metaphor, focusing on ideological, psychosocial, psychological variables, which are not readily observable. How do you know, if you look at a population who has a thrill-seeking personality or low sense of self-control? I mean, you have to really screen them. You have to ask them questions, and it's not really clear. So it's not really helpful for policy making to know that these psychological characteristics identify your population at risk, because you have no idea how to find them. So what we wanted to do is to use observable or more readily available demographic life background characteristics to understand risk profiles in the population. We look specifically to profile individuals. We look at intentions to engage in hateful behaviors using a scale we validated and published a year ago. Intentions to engage in hateful behaviors targeting left-wing individuals. And we selected the target group because it's the ideological adversary of the far right, right? Many far-right groups can have a range of hated target groups. Some focus more on the Jews, some focus more on Muslims, immigrants, but they all hate the left, okay? So we used that as our main measurement tool. That tool looks at violent and non-violent intentions. So another aim of the paper is to figure out if people with violent intentions, okay, are any different from people with non-violent hateful intentions within the same ideological group. And that's a comparison that many times it's not found in the literature. So I hope it's clear. We have a sample, a group of far-right people or people who don't like left-wing people. Some of them, a minority, have violent intentions, other non-violent intentions, like they want to avoid left-wing people, discriminate them, they don't want to mix with them, but they're not violent. Are these two groups any different? So this is the main approach. It's not new. I mean, it's an idea we got from public health, basically research. There's a lot of research using latent profile analysis to identify population at risk using demographic data, so subgroups in the population, at risk of a range of things. So we found papers looking at risk of HIV, risk of suicide, and those type of papers are very useful for interventions because they allow to identify subgroups in the population, identify where they go, and find, where you have the most risk in specific groups and where you have to, let's say, target these groups with interventions. I'll be very brief on the literature review, which we did, because we reviewed all the papers that in, let's say, extremism and terrorism research looked at demographic characteristics of both offenders, extreme right offenders, and people in population surveys with intentions to engage in, let's say, political violence. Generally, the picture you see, and I'm simplifying, of course, is in relation to far-right violence, a white underclass, like young males with originating from a marginalized background, with previous criminal history, of course, history in some papers of substance abuse, and a range of issues. At the same time, we know, and yesterday we talked about it in a few presentations, that the demographics are shifting. So we are seeing a mainstreaming of far-right ideas. So what we wanted to understand is the demographic group at risk of committing ideological violence on the far right changing demographically? Are we looking still at young males, disadvantaged, or someone else? Okay, so we used a national sample provided by YouGov. It's an online sample, so of course there are limitations. But let's say there are a range of online samples of different qualities, and this is a decent quality sample. So its participants are matched to a frame based on gender, age, race, education, using census sources. This is just a part of the, let's say, descriptive statistics of the data we collected. Just letting you know, of course, we run latent profile analysis and multinomial logistic regression to identify people who were more likely to belong to all the profiles, meaning all the, let's say, variables that we created had to be binary variables. And of course, the cutoffs are a little bit arbitrary. I'm telling this because one of the key variables that we found relevant was income, and the cutoff for income are based basically on theoretical reasons, but also making sure that we have enough numbers in each cell to run the regression. So basically, we have some cutoffs we could not change, but I will talk about this in a minute. So this is the scale we used to select or identify the profiles. So it's a 12-item scale, again, validated. The first 4 items capture non-violent intentions. The subsequent 8 items capture a range of violent intentions targeting left-wing people. Of course, you can see, if you look at the median, the mean, sorry, it's collected on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So the mean score for the first 4 items is much higher than the items about violence, meaning people who display violent intentions are, of course, as we should expect, a tiny minority of our sample. Okay, what are the 4 profiles? So profile number 1 is these people. Can you hear me? Yeah. pretty loud. So basically, if you've never seen this type of visualization of latent profile analysis, each point here is one of the items, the 12 items. And each line represents a group. So the first group we found, which is roughly 55% of the sample, are people who have very low intentions to engage in violence against left-wing targets. Just like people who do not express any hate. And we expect that. Then we have, and this is what we call the general population. Second profile, avoidance, we call them. So basically people who score high on the first 4 items of our scale, which is the one with non-violent intent. Okay, people who don't like left-wing people, they don't want a left-wing teacher for their kids, okay? They don't express any violent intent. So high on the first 4, low on the others. Avoidance. Then we have people who we call potentially violent with mixed intentions. So who scored close to 3, which means on the Likert scale, it's in the middle. So they don't express any, they don't agree with the item, but they don't disagree. So these people score on average there, neither agree nor disagree on all the items. And then we have the violent. So the violent profile, and they score very high on all the 12 items. High, like above 4, and 4 is agree with the item, and 5 strongly agree. So these people are 95, so about 6% of the sample. More than we were expecting, actually, but this is the US, so it's... So I will not present the entire table for the multinomial logistic regression, but just this is a summary I created. Who are the people in each of the 3 profiles? Of course, we used as a reference category the general population for the multinomial regression. Age, well, actually, avoidance, so people who dislike people on the left, but they don't display violent intentions, tend to be older, okay, males, less likely to be Black. We had also we had as 3 categories here, white, Latinos, and Blacks. This is interesting, we think, because it speaks about potentially how many Latinos are in that group. But anyway, avoidance, so older males. I'll start talking about the first 3 variables. Interestingly, in the potentially violent and violent profiles, we have younger people. So avoidance, older than the general population, violent and potentially violent, younger, but all of them more likely to be males. In terms of education and income patterns, it's interesting because avoidance and potentially violent are significantly more likely to have lower education, not the violent ones. So the violent start to become interesting. So they're not really what we were expecting them to be. And then we looked at income, and actually people with higher income are more likely to be in the violent profile or expressing violent intentions. And also people more likely to be married, which is something we weren't expecting as well. We think there are some explanations for this, and I will get to it in a minute. And look, this sample is pretty good. It's not a bad sample. So it's not something that we think is explained by, people not giving attention to the questionnaire and just ticking whatever. It's actually a pretty robust finding. All of them are more likely to have regular church attendance than the general population. We believe this is a proxy of conservatism in the US sample, meaning that compared to people in the general population, among which there are many people on the left, we know that conservatives tend to go to church more. But the violent ones, and it's not in the table, but it's in the data, are like 4 times more likely to go to attend church regularly than the general population, and the avoidant and potentially violent only 2 times. So the violent ones actually go to church quite a lot. Mental illness, nothing. Substance abuse, only for the potentially violent, not for the violent and the avoidant. Financial problems, no. Imprisoned, well, the avoidants are less likely to be ever imprisoned, and the violent, as we would expect, more likely. So it's puzzling. Some of the variables behave as we would expect, others definitely don't. So we think, and I'll be brief, unfortunately, there isn't much time, but we thought a lot about these, the implications. So first of all, it challenges the myths of disadvantage and marginalization about people at risk of engaging in ideological violence on the right. Of course, criminal history is still very important, and this confirms research in criminology that happened for a very long time. But income and marriage kind of complicates the assumptions or challenges the assumptions about social bonds. So in criminology, many theories say, well, if you go to church, if you are married, you have strong social bonds, and these should keep you away from criminal action. Well, actually, it depends, first of all, what type of church and what type of social bonds you have, of course. But also, maybe this tells something about the mainstreaming of the far right and the fact that it's not anymore on the fringe. So violent intentions are not anymore in garage where you have the neo-Nazi playing, punk rock and drinking beer, but they are really conversations in dinner tables in families, right, across the US. Families with a good job, a family with married couples and with, an stable income and so on. So this is what we think we see. Last reflection. So church, this is complex and it can be a little bit controversial. But because, again, church attendance is kind of a proxy of conservatism, and we were looking at the far right, so it's to be expected. But at the same time, it tells, from a practical perspective, if you want to reach your population, why don't you partner up with religious institutions like churches and offer programs for people who were imprisoned, for example? So you find people who were imprisoned within these partnering with church institutions, maybe churches that have a consistent or big constituency of males, and maybe younger. Some of them had a criminal history, and you work with them. I mean, I know it's controversial. We have 20 years of post 9/11 partnering with mosques and religious institutions. We know that many times it went wrong. You can alienate, create suspect communities, whatever. But it's still an opportunity, practically, I think, to think about interventions for at-risk groups on the ground, going to churches, because it looks like it's the place where these people tend to go, at least in the US. I think that's it. I'll stop here.